All right, so we're diving into something pretty fascinating today, the philosophy of dance.
Philosophy of dance.
Now, even figuring out what philosophy is can be a whole debate in itself, right? Maybe just look at the American Philosophical Association sometimes.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's a field with a lot of different perspectives and approaches.
But basically, we're going to be looking at how philosophy tackles the big questions about dance. You know?
Like, what does dance even mean? What makes it so important to us as humans?
Exactly, and what it reveals about us and the world around us.
Right away, what's really striking to me is just how broad this field is. I mean, the philosophy of dance doesn't just exist on its own. You know, it's tied in with dance studies, of course.
Oh, we're sure.
But it also draws from all these other areas like sociology, history, even things like cognitive science and anthropology.
It's really interdisciplinary.
When you think about all the different roles dance has played throughout history, you know, it's incredible.
Totally.
From artistic expression to education therapy, social connection, political statements, religious rituals, you name it.
Yeah, you start to see just how much there is to explore here.
I mean, even just trying to define what we consider dance can be tricky.
Oh, absolutely. Like, where do you draw the line?
Like, what about digital dance? Or those super competitive forms that are almost like a sport in a way.
Right. That's still dance? It makes you think?
And what philosophical tools can we even use to try and categorize all of that?
It's like this huge potential landscape for dance philosophy, but it also feels a bit like a Tower of Babel, you know?
So many voices, so many different ways of approaching it.
It's a lot for a philosopher to wade into.
It really is, and it's key to realize that there isn't just one right way to look at dance philosophically.
Yeah, no single lens.
From what we've gathered in the research, there's a whole spectrum of perspectives.
Totally.
You have analytic aesthetics, which often tries to find like the core essence of dance as an art form.
Okay.
Then you have continental philosophy, pragmatic philosophy, process philosophy, all of which tend to be more focused on the lived experience and how things are constantly changing and evolving.
And that's not even getting into the approaches that come more directly from dance studies.
Right, which bring in all those vital cultural and historical contexts.
So it seems like, depending on what school of thought a philosopher comes from, they might end up asking totally different questions about dance.
Absolutely.
Like, someone in analytic aesthetics might try to really nail down what exactly makes something a dance as a work of art, you know?
Trying to define it very precisely.
But then a phenomenologist might be way more interested in the actual dancer's experience of creating or performing a dance.
How it feels from the inside.
It seems like those different focuses could lead to some pretty big disagreements.
Oh, absolutely. What one philosophical camp might see as crucial for understanding dance could be totally irrelevant to another.
Yeah, like a really detailed breakdown of the steps and the choreography.
That might not matter much to someone who's primarily concerned with the dancer's somatic experience.
You know, what it actually feels like to be moving their body.
Right, so knowing about these different methodologies and approaches is so important.
Especially if you're trying to get a handle on the literature.
For sure.
So for this deep dive, we've kind of pulled together the main areas where philosophy is engaging with dance right now.
Sounds good.
We're going to be looking at how philosophers think about the ontology of dance as art.
Its identity, its structure.
And that whole idea of ephemerality, how it's so fleeting and temporary.
And then we'll also be looking at dance as a form of agency and intentional action.
How choreography comes into play, who we consider the author, and even the role of improvisation.
From there, we'll move into the world of lived experience and somatic awareness.
The importance of actually practicing dance and the fascinating bodily responses we have when we watch it.
And that's just the beginning. We'll touch on how dance connects with cognitive science, too.
All that empirical research that's going on.
And then finally, we'll briefly explore some of the broader connections.
Things like non-Western philosophies of dance, ethical and sociopolitical considerations, and the growing impact of technology.
It's a lot to cover.
Our goal here is to distill some key insights from all of this.
And give you, our listeners, a shortcut to understanding this whole area of philosophy.
All the different and often surprising ways philosophers are thinking about dance.
Exactly.
All right, so with that in mind, why don't we get started?
Let's start with the analytic ontology of dance as art.
Okay, sounds good.
One of the central puzzles here is the whole question of identity and reconstruction.
What makes a dance what it is, and how do we even identify it?
Right. Philosophers are grappling with this fundamental question, what is a dance? Is it like a fixed entity, a blueprint like a musical score? Or is it something more fluid, a process that unfolds in time?
It's like those classic debates in the philosophy of music about what a symphony really is.
Exactly.
Is it the composer's original handwritten score, or a specific performance by an orchestra, or some abstract idea that connects them all.
Those same challenges apply to dance, but they're even more intense because dance is so inherently physical and time-based.
It's gone as soon as it's performed.
Some philosophers like Nelson Goodman and Graham McPhee lean towards the idea that a dance has some kind of underlying structure.
Like a blueprint.
Right. They might look for something analogous to a musical score, even though we don't really have a formal notation system for dance that everyone agrees on.
Yeah, that's a big difference from music.
The main idea here is to try and find some object of appreciation that can be analyzed apart from individual subjective experiences.
Okay, so something that's not just about how one person feels when they watch the dance.
Exactly. McPhee, for instance, talks about dance works as performables that are realized in repeatable performances.
Okay.
He points to these classic works like Swan Lake as examples of dances that have kept a recognizable identity throughout history.
Even though each performance is going to be a little different.
Right, but then there are other thinkers who really challenge this whole structuralist view.
They think it's too rigid.
They argue that dance often doesn't rely on written plans or scores in the same way music often does.
It's more spontaneous.
Even when a notation exists, it might be more like inspiration or a loose guide than a strict blueprint.
And like we said, there's no universal notation system for dance.
Which really complicates the idea of a definitive reproducible work.
So if there's no score, how can you say it's the same dance?
Right. Mark Franco, for instance, talks about this tension between dance as writing and dance as something that can't be fully captured by language.
You can't just write it down and get the whole thing.
He and others argue that focusing too much on a theoretical underlying structure might make us miss the unique and essential aspects of the actual performance.
And the lived experience of the dancer.
They emphasize those really important bodily, tactile, dynamic elements of dance.
It's not just about the steps, it's about how they're performed.
Exactly, and this naturally leads into the whole concept of dance as an ephemeral art form.
It's here and then it's gone.
The critic Marcia Siegel famously called dance a perpetual vanishing point.
I like that.
It takes shape for a moment in a performance and then it disappears.
No lasting object.
There are a few different ways to interpret this ephemerality.
Like, how do we even think about it?
One perspective, maybe a bit more critical, focuses on the challenges it creates for preserving and accurately reconstructing dances from the past.
Because there's no physical object to preserve.
McPhee, for instance, sees this instability of dance works as a problem that comes from not having good enough methods of preservation.
He thinks we need better notation systems.
Right. He thinks if we had more advanced notation in the future, it would help solve this.
But then there's a more appreciative way to look at this fleeting nature of dance.
Right. Some people celebrate that unique quality of life performance.
You had to be there.
Exactly. They argue that this impermanence is part of what makes dance so powerful aesthetically.
And this is more special.
It contributes to the intensity of our responses and creates this vital, immediate experience for both the performers and the audience.
Makes you feel more present in the moment.
Renee Conroy, for example, while acknowledging the preservation issue, also sees ephemerality as kind of an accepted fact within the dance world. There's this shared understanding that choreography will naturally evolve and change over time.
It's not meant to be frozen in time.
So while the lack of a fixed object might seem like a problem to some, it's seen as a positive, inherent part of the art form by others.
Interesting. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about dance as agency and intentional action.
Right, sounds good.
Here, philosophers were really looking at the skilled action involved in dance.
In all its forms.
Right, from artistic performance to social dances, even those borderline cases with sports we talked about earlier.
It's a wide range.
When we look at dance as expert action, the philosophical analysis often focuses on the incredible technical abilities of dancers.
Their athleticism, their artistry.
Like their expressiveness and grace.
And for those philosophers who are concerned with defining a dance work, these actions are seen as crucial.
They make the work what it is.
For McShee, these actions are fundamentally tied to the structure of the work itself.
Okay, so the actions aren't just performing the work. They're part of its very essence.
Right. And we also see this question of what is dance being explored through the lens of expressiveness in action theory.
Interesting.
The idea here is that certain movements, like running, for example, can become dance if they're done under certain conditions.
Like if you're doing it on a stage.
Right, or within a specific dance vocabulary, and offered for aesthetic appreciation by an audience.
So the context matters a lot.
Samajin Cohen, for instance, famously argued that expressiveness is just inherent to all dance.
Like it can't be separated from it.
Right, and this led Monroe Beardsley to propose that maybe expressiveness is even a necessary condition for something to be considered art.
You can't have dance art without it.
Drawing on action theory, he suggested that one type of bodily action can be sort of transformed into another, more expressive action within the context of dance.
Interesting.
This was a direct challenge to earlier views that said dance movements weren't even intentional actions at all.
Wow, so they were basically saying dance isn't a real action.
In a way.
Yeah. That's pretty wild.
And then you have thinkers like Suzanne Langer, who saw dance not so much as action in the typical sense, but more like a fundamental way of making symbols.
Okay.
She thought that dance transforms everyday activities into this virtual artistic realm.
It takes them out of the ordinary.
And the primary symbol for her was what she called virtual power or gesture.
So it's about what the movement represents rather than the movement itself.
Right. This seems to connect with McPhee's later idea of dance as embodied meaning.
Okay, so Langer's perspective is really shifting the focus away from literal everyday actions and toward the symbolic potential of movement.
Exactly. In contrast, you have Anna Pakes, along with Aaron Meskin and Sandra Horton Fraley, who are more aligned with the idea of dance as intentional transitive action.
Okay.
They argue that because dance is so embodied in a physical intentional event, it makes more sense to understand it as an action structure rather than a pre-existing abstract ideal.
It's about what's happening in the moment.
Exactly. And this leads us to the complex questions of choreography and authorship.
Who gets to say they created a dance?
Oh. It's a big question, right? Is it solely the choreographer who comes up with the initial idea and structure? Or do the dancers themselves have a creative role through their performance and interpretation?
It's a collaboration in a way.
This is a major point of debate. Julie Van Camp, for example, argues that dancers often contribute significant structural and stylistic elements during rehearsals and performances.
It's not just about following the steps.
Right. She says these contributions go way beyond simply interpreting what's already there.
They're actually shaping the dance.
And if these contributions are substantial and integral to the final form, she argues they might actually be acts of creation.
Interesting. So the dancers are co-creators.
In a sense, yeah.
But then you have Graham McPhee and Chris Chalice, who take a different view.
They emphasize the choreographer as the primary author.
And the dancer is more of an instrument.
They see the dancer's expertise as being primarily in their ability to skillfully execute the choreography.
Rather than in coming up with the dance itself.
Right. This perspective has been criticized, though, for potentially overlooking the artistic contributions of the performers.
Yeah, it seems a bit unfair to just see them as tools.
McPhee supports his argument by tying authorship to the idea of responsibility.
Okay.
Who's ultimately responsible for the work.
Interesting. But that gets into all sorts of issues around intellectual property and copyright.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And it's worth noting that the legal framework for copyright doesn't always line up perfectly with the philosophical ideas about authorship in dance.
The messy area.
And all the intricacies of copyright and choreography, that's a whole other conversation.
Whole other deep dives.
Right, and then there's the whole question of improvisation in dance.
Where it seems like the lines of authorship and creation get even blurrier.
Absolutely. Improvisation refers to the agency of both the dance maker and the performer in the moment.
They're not following a set plan.
Right. Curtis Carter helpfully broke down improvisation into three main types.
Okay, let's hear it.
First, there's embellishment, where you're adding flourishes to existing choreography. Okay. Second, you have the use of spontaneous movement within a structured piece. So there's some set material, but also room for improvisation.
Okay.
And third, you have improvisation for its own sake, where the movement is completely created in the moment.
Like they just start moving and see what happens.
Exactly. Contact improvisation is a good example of this.
It's fascinating how much agency the dancers have in that form.
But even this idea of complete freedom in improvisation has been questioned. Danielle Goldman, for instance, argues that there are all sorts of social and historical constraints that can limit true improvisational freedom.
You can't just do anything.
Right. She suggests thinking about improvisation as a state of preparation and responsiveness.
Okay.
You're ready to respond to whatever comes up.
But you're still working within certain boundaries.
Exactly. And Susan Lee Foster adds a phenomenological perspective.
What does that look like?
She says the key moment in improvisation is that split second right before movement happens.
A potential.
That not quite known space of possibility.
It's like the moment of decision before you jump off a cliff.
She describes the experience of improvising as this kind of middle voice.
Interesting.
It's this flow of movement that exists between conscious, deliberate choice and a more passive, intuitive guidance.
You're not totally in control, but you're not totally letting go either.
Right. It's somewhere in between.
It's like riding a wave.
And it's interesting how this concept of improvisation goes beyond those formal categories, too.
Oh, how so?
You have somatic improvisation, which is often used to achieve a specific internal bodily state.
It's okay.
And then challenge dance, which comes from African American traditions and where a lot of the improvisation is driven by competition.
Showing off your skills.
Exactly. And Ailey Bresnahan even makes the argument that all live dance performance has some degree of improvisation.
Because every performance is going to be unique in some way.
Right. You can never replicate it exactly.
So even if you're following a choreography, there's still that element of spontaneity.
Which brings us to our third key area, dance lived experience and somatic awareness.
We're getting into the feeling of it now.
Here we're looking at philosophical traditions that really value lived experience as evidence.
Not just abstract theories, but what it actually feels like.
Exactly. And this includes our direct bodily and somatic experiences.
What's going on in our bodies?
Phenomenology is a central approach here, with thinkers exploring the dancer's subjective first-person experience and their deep bodily awareness.
It's about how the dancer feels from the inside out.
Figures like John Dewey and Maurice Merleau-Ponty have had a huge influence in this area.
They really emphasize the importance of experience.
They saw art as both an active process and a deeply experiential phenomenon.
Okay.
Their work has inspired dance philosophers to really delve into the felt, lived aspects of dance.
For both performers and audience members?
Richard Schusterman has developed this whole area of somasthetics.
Somasthetics.
It's a phenomenological theory that aims to understand our embodied engagement with art forms, including dance.
What does that mean exactly?
It involves this heightened awareness of our internal bodily processes.
Okay. How we experience our own bodies in motion and at rest.
It's about really paying attention to the sensations.
And philosophers working in this framework see the actual practice of dance, not just theorizing about it, as a legitimate source of insight.
So you can learn about philosophy by actually dancing.
Exactly.
This approach is pretty different from traditional analytic aesthetics, where the focus is often on the abstract properties of the work itself.
Right. But it's interesting how even some analytic philosophers are starting to acknowledge the importance of dance practice.
Like they're seeing the value of actually getting up and moving.
David Davies, for example, talks about this pragmatic constraint on theories of art.
What does that mean?
He's basically saying that these theories should be grounded in what we can actually observe in real-world artistic practices.
So you can't just theorize in a vacuum. You have to see how it plays out in real life.
Right, and Barbara Montero makes a strong case for the expertise of dance practitioners.
So dancers actually have a kind of knowledge that's valuable to philosophers. Exactly. She uses empirical evidence to show their unique abilities.
So it's not just about theory, it's about what dancers know and can do.
And Julie Van Camp and Renee Conroy have also argued for analytic dance aesthetics to be more in touch with real-world practices.
Huh?
Van Camp suggests understanding the identity of artworks in a more pragmatic way through how they're actually talked about and used by the community.
So look at what's happening on the ground.
Conroy offers a set of minimal desiderata for understanding dance work identity.
Criteria that focus on how things are actually done in the dance world.
Right now, a particularly fascinating aspect of lived experience in dance is the way our bodies respond when we watch it.
Like we might feel our heart rate go up or a tension in our muscles.
Or even a sense of mirroring the movement.
It's like our bodies are trying to dance along.
So how do we understand these responses philosophically?
That's a great question.
One key question is about the causal process behind these responses.
What's actually happening in our bodies to make this happen?
Right. How does empathy with the performer's movement translate into these sensations we feel?
It's like some kind of physical connection.
Some contemporary philosophers, especially Barbara Montero, are looking to cognitive science and neuroscience for answers.
Okay.
They're exploring how neurological mechanisms like mirror neurons might be involved.
Mirror neuron.
Yeah, they're these neurons that fire both when we do an action and when we see someone else doing the same action.
So they're like reflecting the movement.
Exactly. And Montero thinks they might contribute to our experience of proprioception.
Proprioception.
It's basically the sense of our own body's position and movement.
Okay, so it's like we're sensing the dancer's movement as if it were our own.
In a way, yeah.
That's pretty trippy.
This leads us to our fourth area, the intersection of dance and cognitive science.
It seems like there's a growing interest in using empirical research to understand the cognitive and physical aspects of dance.
Both in creating and appreciating it.
So we're not just thinking about it conceptually, we're actually looking at the data.
Exactly. A lot of philosophers are now engaging with research on things like motor control perception and how the brain processes movement.
Okay.
They're looking at how the brains of professional dancers might be different from non-dancers.
Like, do they have special brain wiring?
How we perceive and interpret the information conveyed through movement and the nature of those bodily responses we talked about.
So it's getting down to the nuts and bolts of how our brains and bodies experience dance.
And Barbara Montero goes so far as to suggest that proprioception might even be its own aesthetic sense.
Like sight or hearing.
Right. And she also proposes that highly trained dancers might have enhanced proprioceptive abilities.
Because they're so aware of their own bodies.
Exactly. And this could make them more discerning judges of dance.
Like they can feel the nuances that others might miss.
Noel Carroll has also looked at how the combination of dance and music might affect our bodily responses.
So it's not just the movement, it's the music too.
He draws on Montero's research, but also John Martin's theory of metakinetic transfer.
Metakinetic transfer. That's a mouthful.
It's the idea that seeing movement can trigger similar motor responses in the observer.
Like our bodies want to move along with what we're seeing.
Exactly.
So the philosophers who are into this integration of cognitive science, they argue that understanding the neurobiological basis of our experience is crucial for understanding dance as an art form.
They think this kind of research can shed light on how we engage with dance cognitively, kinesthetically, and emotionally.
So it's not just about the philosophical ideas, it's about the actual physical processes in our brains and bodies.
But of course, not everyone agrees with this approach.
There's always pushback.
Graham McPhee, for example, is pretty skeptical.
He doesn't buy it.
He argues that causal explanations from science aren't really relevant to dance appreciation.
So knowing how the brain works doesn't tell us how to appreciate a dance.
Right. He thinks appreciation happens at a personal and cultural level of meaning-making.
It's about what the dance means to us, not what's happening in our neurons.
Exactly.
But David Davies offers a kind of middle ground perspective.
He acknowledges that some philosophical questions about dance, especially those involving value judgments.
Like what makes a good dance?
Right. Those probably can't be answered by scientific research.
Science can't tell us what's beautiful.
But he still thinks philosophy should be informed by scientific findings.
So we shouldn't ignore the science, even if it's not the whole story.
Exactly. He says it's important to make sure our philosophical views are consistent with our understanding of the natural world.
So if science shows us something about how the brain works on dance, we should take that into account.
Right, and he even suggests that empirical research can help us avoid making false assumptions about the arts.
Interesting. So science can actually help us do philosophy better.
In a way, yeah.
Okay, so to wrap things up, let's touch on some of the other important directions in the philosophy of dance.
The field is constantly evolving.
One crucial area is the increasing engagement with non-Western and non-traditional philosophies of dance.
We need to look beyond the Western canon.
Right, and explore the diverse perspectives found in religious studies, ethnography, oral histories, and the artistic expressions of different cultures around the world.
If we want the philosophy of dance to be truly comprehensive, it needs to include these broader traditions.
It can't just be a Western conversation.
And we're also seeing a growing focus on the intersection of dance ethics and social political philosophy.
So looking at things like power dynamics, oppression identity.
The ethical dimensions of dance practice and performance.
It's about recognizing that dance isn't just about aesthetics, it's also about social and political issues.
And philosophers are drawing on insights from critical studies, gender studies, disability studies, all sorts of areas to explore these connections.
It's a really important development.
And of course, we can't forget about the impact of technology.
Technology is changing everything.
As dance incorporates digital platforms, film, and various forms of technological enhancement, we need new philosophical frameworks to understand these new art forms.
It's a whole new landscape.
We're dealing with questions about embodiment in virtual spaces, the nature of virtuality itself, and even the definition of dance in a digital age.
It's like we're redefining what dance can be.
Absolutely.
Okay, so as we start to wrap up this deep dive, let's quickly recap the key areas we've explored.
Sounds good.
We've looked at the debate about whether a dance is a stable, definable structure or a fluid, ephemeral event.
Highlighting the challenges of defining its identity and reconstructing it accurately, even with famous works like Swan Lake.
And given the limitations of our current notation systems,
We also consider dance as an ephemeral art form, acknowledging both the concerns about preservation and the unique aesthetic value of its fleeting nature.
And our discussion of agency and intentional action revealed the complexities of choreography, the question of authorship, and the different forms of improvisation.
From embellishment to spontaneous creation like contact improvisation.
We then explore the importance of lived experience and somatic awareness, contrasting phenomenological approaches with analytic aesthetics.
And emphasizing the importance of actually practicing dance.
We also touched on the intersection of dance and cognitive science, with different views on the relevance of scientific research to our understanding and appreciation of dance.
Especially those bodily responses we talked about.
Finally, we touched on the expansion of dance philosophy to include non-Western perspectives, ethical and social political considerations, and the impact of technology.
It's a lot to take in.
It really is.
It makes you wonder what all of this says about our basic assumptions about art, about identity, about human experience, about knowledge itself.
Do these different philosophical approaches to dance challenge those assumptions, or do they reinforce them?
And this Tower of Babel of different methodologies, does it ultimately enrich our understanding or just create more confusion?
There's a lot to think about.
It really is. But hopefully this deep dive has given you a new appreciation for the philosophical depths of dance.
It's not just about moving your body. It's about exploring some of the biggest questions we face as humans.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening, everybody.